March 22, 1945. Oppenheim, Germany. 10:47 p.m. The Rhine moves in darkness, ancient and indifferent, its black waters carrying the weight of European history in every current. For centuries, this river has been the natural fortress of German defense, the liquid wall that Napoleon himself declared unconquerable in winter. Tonight, its surface reflects no moon, only the occasional flicker of distant artillery fire painting momentary constellations across the rippling void. On the eastern bank, Oberst Friedrich Weber of the Wehrmacht's 7th Army stands in a concrete observation post, binoculars pressed against wind-chapped skin, watching the western shore with the mechanical discipline of a man who has stopped believing his own eyes matter. Somewhere across that darkness, he has been told, General George S. Patton Jr. commands the American Third Army. But Weber, like most of the German High Command, has long since dismissed Patton as a fiction, a phantom conjured by Allied intelligence to mask their real intentions. The true threat, Berlin insists, remains north at Calais, where the non-existent 1st United States Army Group supposedly masses for the killing blow. Patton is noise. Patton is theater. Patton is everything except real. By dawn, American tanks will be rolling through Weber's position, and the Oberst will spend his final conscious moments before capture wondering how an entire military apparatus could be so catastrophically, so utterly wrong. The deception that made this crossing possible began not in 1945, but years earlier, in the Baroque corridors of British intelligence and the sprawling headquarters of American strategic planning. Operation Fortitude, the grand Allied deception scheme surrounding D-Day, had planted George Patton at its center as the commander of a ghost army, a fabrication so elaborate, so meticulously crafted, that German intelligence accepted it as gospel. Dummy tanks constructed of inflatable rubber and wooden scaffolding filled English fields. Radio operators transmitted endless false communications. Double agents fed carefully calibrated lies through channels Berlin trusted implicitly. And at the heart of this magnificent fiction stood Patton himself, very real, very dangerous, and deliberately sidelined after the genuine Normandy invasion as punishment for slapping shell-shocked soldiers in Sicily. The Germans, observing Patton's public disgrace and subsequent exile to command the phantom FUSAG, concluded precisely what Allied deception officers hoped they would conclude, that Patton was too valuable to waste on diversionary operations, that his presence in England meant the real invasion still loomed, and that Normandy was merely a feint to draw German reserves away from Calais. Even after Patton took command of the very real Third Army in August 1944 and began tearing across France with a velocity that shocked friend and enemy alike, German intelligence struggled to reconcile their previous assessments with observable reality. Cognitive dissonance became strategic doctrine. Reports of Patton's movements were discounted, reinterpreted, filed away as probable misinformation. When Third Army units appeared on the battlefield, German commanders questioned whether Patton himself was actually present or whether the Americans were using his name to create confusion. The mythology of deception had become so powerful that it survived contact with truth. By spring 1945, as Allied armies closed in on the Rhine from multiple directions, significant portions of the Wehrmacht still believed the main American thrust would come from the north, that Patton remained primarily a psychological weapon rather than a kinetic one, and that the Third Army's aggressive southern positioning was elaborate misdirection. This conviction ran deepest in the minds of those who had never faced Patton's forces directly. For the German soldiers who had fought Third Army units in the Lorraine, in the Ardennes, in the brutal winter campaigns that ground through villages and forests with mechanical efficiency, there was no question about Patton's reality. They had felt his doctrine of relentless aggression, his refusal to pause for consolidation, his belief that wars were won by making the enemy react rather than by reacting oneself. These veterans carried a different kind of knowledge in their exhausted bodies, the understanding that Patton's army moved like nothing else they had encountered, that it possessed a speed and flexibility that violated German assumptions about American military capability. But these combat veterans were not the men briefing Hitler in Berlin. Their reports from frozen foxholes carried less weight than the elegant assessments produced by intelligence officers who had never heard a Sherman tank's engine roar to life at 3 in the morning. The Rhine represented Germany's last natural defensive barrier, a geographical fact that had shaped European warfare for millennia. Its width, varying from 300 to 400 meters in the sectors the Americans approached, made any crossing a massive engineering challenge. Its current ran swift and unpredictable, capable of sweeping away assault boats and drowning men weighted down with combat gear. The eastern banks rose in places to commanding heights that offered defenders clear fields of fire across the entire river's breadth. And unlike the English Channel, which the Allies had crossed through surprise and overwhelming force, the Rhine had to be taken against an enemy who knew exactly where the attack would come and who had been preparing defensive positions for months. The conventional military wisdom, endorsed by British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and most American senior commanders, called for a massive, methodical, set-piece assault, weeks of aerial bombardment to suppress German artillery, extensive reconnaissance to identify every defensive position, the accumulation of overwhelming material. Superiority before a single boat touched water. Montgomery's crossing of the Rhine at Wesel, scheduled for late March, embodied this philosophy perfectly. Operation Plunder would employ over 30 divisions, thousands of artillery pieces, massive aerial bombardment by the RAF and U.S. Army Air Forces, and an airborne assault by 2 full divisions to secure the eastern banks. The planning had consumed months. The logistics were staggering: thousands of tons of bridging equipment, specialized assault boats, amphibious vehicles, all positioned and carefully coordinated. It was warfare as industrial process, methodical and inexorable, designed to minimize risk through the application of crushing material advantage. It was also, to Patton's mind, exactly wrong. Patton had been studying the Rhine for months, not as an obstacle to be respected but as a problem to be solved through speed and audacity. His doctrine, refined through 3 years of combat from Morocco to the German frontier, rejected the idea that massive preparation guaranteed success. Quite the opposite: the more time spent preparing, the more time the enemy had to prepare as well. Surprise and momentum were weapons as powerful as artillery, perhaps more so, because they disrupted the enemy's decision-making cycle, forced him to react rather than act, created the psychological conditions for collapse. Throughout the war, Patton had watched other commanders pause to consolidate gains, regroup, build up supplies, and he had watched the Germans use those pauses to establish new defensive lines, bring up reserves, turn what could have been routes into extended campaigns. The lesson was clear: never give the enemy time to think. So even as Montgomery prepared his elaborate Rhine crossing in the north, Patton ordered his Third Army to approach the river in the south not as a final barrier but as another river to be crossed, difficult certainly but not fundamentally different from the Moselle or the Saar or any of the other waterways they had already forced. He told his subordinate commanders something that must have sounded like madness or arrogance or both: they would cross the Rhine quickly, without the massive preparation Montgomery deemed essential, without waiting for the accumulation of specialized equipment, and if possible, before Montgomery's carefully scheduled operation even began. The goal was not merely to reach the eastern bank but to do so in a way that psychologically shattered German defensive confidence, that proved the Wehrmacht's last great natural barrier could be breached not through overwhelming force but through speed, flexibility, and the aggressive exploitation of any opportunity that presented itself. The opportunity came at Oppenheim, a small town on the Rhine south of Mainz, where German defenses were lighter than in other sectors for the simple reason that the terrain on the western bank made it a less obvious crossing point. Patton's intelligence officers identified it not as the perfect location but as a possible one, and in Patton's doctrine, possible was sufficient. On March 22, as Montgomery continued his meticulous preparations 30 miles north, elements of the 3rd Army's 5th Infantry Division began crossing the Rhine at Oppenheim in assault boats, without preliminary bombardment, without airborne support, without any of the massive infrastructure that conventional wisdom deemed necessary. The first wave hit the eastern bank at 10 p.m., in darkness, against surprise and thinly spread German defenders. By midnight, infantry companies were establishing positions inland. By dawn, engineers were constructing pontoon bridges under sporadic artillery fire. Within 24 hours, entire battalions had crossed. Within 48 hours, tanks were rolling over completed bridges onto German soil. The German response was chaos compounded by disbelief. Local commanders reported American crossings to higher headquarters and were told, essentially, that this was impossible. Patton's army was not supposed to be capable of this kind of operation. The Oppenheim sector was not properly prepared for defense because it was not expected to be attacked, and besides, the real American crossing would come with Montgomery in the north. By the time the reports were taken seriously and reserves were ordered toward Oppenheim, Patton's bridgehead was already expanding, his armor was already moving inland, his momentum was already building toward the kind of breakthrough that the Rhine was supposed to prevent. The Wehrmacht's defensive strategy, predicated on holding the river line long enough to establish new defensive positions deeper in Germany, collapsed in days instead of weeks. And the psychological impact was devastating. If the Rhine could not stop the Americans, what could? Oberst Weber, watching American tanks emerge from the morning fog on March 24, later told interrogators that his first reaction was not fear but confusion. His orders had been to hold the river line against what would surely be a massive, methodical assault preceded by days of bombardment. Instead, the Americans were already across, already consolidating, already pushing inland as if the Rhine were a minor inconvenience rather than Germany's last great hope. He remembered thinking that his intelligence briefings must have been catastrophically wrong, that someone far above his rank had made decisions based on fantasy rather than reality, and that the war, which he had believed might be prolonged for months through defense of the Rhine, was functionally over. When his position was overrun later that day, he surrendered without firing a shot, not because he lacked courage but because he understood that shooting would merely delay the inevitable by minutes. What Weber could not have known was that his confusion mirrored a broader German crisis of understanding. For years, the Wehrmacht had fought according to certain assumptions about American military capability, that American soldiers were poorly trained and motivated by materialism rather than ideology, that American generals were cautious and predictable, that American doctrine prioritized overwhelming force over speed or creativity. Patton violated all of these assumptions simultaneously. His soldiers demonstrated speed and flexibility that rivaled German mechanized units at their peak. His command decisions were aggressive to the point of recklessness by German standards, yet they consistently worked because they were predicated on understanding that psychological momentum was as important as material position. And his logistics, the unglamorous but essential business of keeping fuel, ammunition, and food moving forward, were so effective that his units rarely paused for lack of supplies despite advancing faster than their own supply lines could theoretically support. This logistical achievement requires emphasis because it contradicted another fundamental German assumption, that American abundance was strategically meaningless, that having more tanks and more trucks simply meant more targets for German artillery, that material superiority could not compensate for tactical skill or fighting spirit. The Rhine crossing demonstrated otherwise. Patton's engineers constructed multiple bridges under fire in days. His supply units pushed fuel and ammunition forward continuously, adapting to changing circumstances in real time. His maintenance crews kept armor operational at rates that German quartermasters would have considered impossible. This was not just abundance, it was abundance organized and directed with speed and precision, abundance as weapon rather than mere resource. German soldiers, even those who fought fanatically until their ammunition ran out, found themselves facing an enemy whose ammunition never seemed to run out, whose damaged tanks were replaced or repaired overnight, whose soldiers always seemed to have hot food and dry socks. Despite advancing faster than any supply system should have supported. The symbolic weight of the Rhine crossing extended beyond its immediate tactical significance. For the German military and civilian population, the Rhine represented not just a defensive barrier but a psychological threshold, the edge of Germany proper, the line beyond which the war would become undeniably a war of national survival rather than territorial defense. Its crossing by American forces, particularly by Patton's Third Army, which German intelligence had alternately dismissed as phantom or relegated to secondary importance, shattered the already crumbling narrative that Germany might yet negotiate some kind of conditional surrender or defensive stalemate. The Americans were not going to pause at the Rhine. They were not going to give Germany time to regroup or to hope for political miracles. They were going to continue advancing, at Patton's relentless pace, until Germany ceased to exist as a functioning state. In Berlin, Hitler raged against his generals, demanding explanations for how Patton, whom he alternately believed was a fiction and a mediocrity, had crossed the Rhine so quickly. The explanations satisfied no one because the truth was too complex and too damning. German intelligence had failed not because it lacked information but because it had built an entire analytical framework on false assumptions and then defended those assumptions against contrary evidence. Patton was real, had always been real, and his sidelining after Sicily had been internal American politics rather than proof of incompetence. The Ghost Army at Dover had been exactly that: ghosts, rubber, wood, and radio transmissions. And the German military, having survived 4 years of brutal warfare against the Soviet Union, having learned to compensate for material inferiority through tactical excellence and defensive skill, had somehow convinced itself that the Americans posed less danger than the Soviets because Americans were soft, cautious, bound by democratic politics and casualty concerns. The soldiers of the Third Army who poured across the Rhine bridges in late March carried with them not just weapons and equipment but the weight of something their German opponents struggled to understand, a kind of casual competence born from industrial abundance and democratic culture. German soldiers, interviewed after capture, frequently expressed bewilderment at American attitudes toward hierarchy and orders. American enlisted men spoke to officers with a familiarity that would have been punished as insubordination in the Wehrmacht. American units solved problems through improvisation and individual initiative rather than waiting for orders from above. American logistics operated through a kind of organized chaos that nevertheless delivered food, fuel, and ammunition with astonishing reliability. This was not the rigid, hierarchical, ideologically driven military force that German doctrine anticipated. It was something stranger and, ultimately, more effective, a military organization that reflected American society's pragmatic, improvisational, materially abundant character. The food became its own kind of psychological weapon. German soldiers, subsisting on increasingly meager rations as their supply lines collapsed, encountered American POWs who complained about the quality of their meals, not the quantity, but the quality, as if having enough to eat was so assumed that they could afford to be particular about taste and variety. Captured American supply dumps revealed staggering quantities not just of ammunition and fuel but of cigarettes, chocolate, canned fruit, coffee, and other items that Germans had not seen in civilian stores for years. One Wehrmacht lieutenant, captured near the Rhine and held temporarily in an American rear area compound, later reported that he had been fed better as a prisoner in 3 days than he had been fed as a soldier in 3 months. The realization that even America's prisoners ate better than Germany's combat troops carried implications that went beyond morale. It suggested that the material disparity between the two nations was so vast that no amount of tactical skill or ideological commitment could bridge it. Patton understood this psychological dimension instinctively, even if he rarely articulated it explicitly. His insistence on speed and aggression was not merely tactical preference but strategic wisdom, every day the war continued was a day Germany's soldiers saw more clearly that they were fighting for a regime that could not feed them, could not supply them, could not protect their families from Allied bombing, and could not offer any credible path to victory. Conversely, every day American forces remained static was a day German propaganda could claim that the Americans had paused because they lacked the will to continue, that democratic societies would eventually tire of casualties and seek negotiated peace. By crossing the Rhine quickly and then pushing east without pause, Patton denied Germany both time to reorganize and hoped that American resolve might weaken. The bridges at Oppenheim became historical markers not because they were the only Rhine crossings. Montgomery's operation at Wesel succeeded a day later, and other Allied forces crossed at multiple points in the following weeks, but because they demonstrated that speed and audacity could achieve at lower cost what massive preparation achieved at higher cost. Montgomery's crossing, for all its careful planning, suffered more casualties than Patton's improvised assault. The very fact of preparation telegraphed intent, allowed the Germans to position reserves, turned the crossing into a frontal assault against prepared defenses. Patton's crossing succeeded partly through surprise but mostly through momentum. The German defensive plan assumed time to react, and by crossing quickly and then expanding the bridgehead immediately, Patton denied that time. Years later, military historians would debate whether Patton's methods were replicable or whether they depended on unique circumstances and his particular personality. The consensus has generally been that Patton's doctrine worked because it was suited to the specific conditions of 1944 to 1945 Western Europe, an enemy already weakened by years of attrition, Allied material superiority, and command of the air. Against a fresh, well-supplied opponent, Patton's aggressive tactics might have resulted in overextension and disaster. But this misses a deeper truth that Patton himself understood. Warfare is as much psychological as physical, and the perception of momentum can be as powerful as actual material advantage. By acting as if the Rhine were just another river, Patton made it just another river. By refusing to treat German defenses as fundamentally insurmountable, he ensured they were not. The symbolic object that threads through this narrative is not a weapon or a tool but a sound, the sound of tank engines starting in darkness, the mechanical roar that American tankers heard so often they ceased to consciously notice it but that German defenders heard with dread because it meant movement, advance, attack. Patton's armor moved at night when conventional doctrine said tanks should halt. It moved in weather that other commanders used as excuse for pause. It moved when fuel was scarce by prioritizing forward units over rear logistics. The sound of those engines, echoing across the Rhine Valley in late March 1945, represented something fundamental about American military culture, the belief that problems existed to be solved through application of energy and resources, that obstacles were temporary, that movement and action were default settings to be maintained unless absolutely impossible. German defenders along the Rhine heard those engines and knew what they meant. They had heard them before in France, in Belgium, in the Ardennes when Patton's army pivoted north to break the German offensive in a maneuver that required relocating entire divisions over winter roads in days. They had learned that American tanks did not stay where intelligence said they were, that American commanders did not follow predictable patterns, that American logistics performed minor miracles daily to keep fuel flowing to spearheads that operated beyond where supply lines should reach. The sound of engines meant that the Americans were coming, not tomorrow, not next week, but now, and that the careful defensive plans predicated on having time to react were already obsolete. After the Rhine crossing, the Third Army advanced east with a velocity that shocked even American high command. Towns that German staff officers believed would require days to capture fell in hours. Defensive positions painstakingly prepared over months were bypassed and isolated rather than assaulted frontally. The Wehrmacht's carefully planned defense in depth, designed to extract maximum delay from every river line and hill, collapsed as Patton's armor simply refused to stop advancing long enough for the defense to cohere. By mid-April, Third Army units had advanced hundreds of kilometers into Germany, liberating concentration camps, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and demonstrating conclusively that the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. For the German soldiers who had believed Patton was bogus, phantom, allied deception rather than real threat, the Rhine crossing and subsequent advance constituted a brutal education in the course of believing intelligence assessments over observable reality. The Wehrmacht had not lost the Rhine because it lacked capable soldiers or because its defensive positions were poorly prepared. It had lost the Rhine because its command structure, from Hitler down through the General Staff, had convinced itself of falsehoods about American capability and had maintained those falsehoods long after evidence demanded reassessment. Patton was real. His army was real. And their speed and aggression were not anomalies to be dismissed but characteristics to be feared. The epilogue to this story lies not in the statistics of the Rhine crossing, the numbers of bridges built, divisions deployed, casualties inflicted and suffered, but in what it revealed about the nature of warfare in industrial democracies. Germany had entered the war believing that democratic societies were inherently weak in sustained conflict, that their armies would lack the ideological commitment and tactical skill of totalitarian forces, that their material advantages would be squandered through political indecision and military caution. The Rhine crossing demonstrated the opposite. American forces combined material abundance with tactical flexibility, democratic culture with military effectiveness, individual initiative with organizational coherence. The very characteristics that Nazi ideology dismissed as weaknesses, American pragmatism, diversity, decentralization of decision-making, proved to be sources of strength. Patton himself, that complex amalgam of profanity and poetry, tactical brilliance, and personal instability, embodied these contradictions. He was not the soft, cautious, material-obsessed American that German propaganda mocked. He was aggressive, sometimes reckless, absolutely committed to victory through offensive action. But he was also dependent on the vast logistical apparatus that American industry provided, on the initiative of subordinate officers who executed his intent rather than his orders, on the flexibility of a military culture that allowed junior leaders to adapt and improvise. He could not have existed in the Wehrmacht, where his insubordination would have been punished and his tactical freedom curtailed. He could only have thrived in an American military structure that was simultaneously hierarchical and surprisingly democratic. The Rhine flows today as it flowed in March 1945, ancient and indifferent, carrying the weight of history in currents that do not care who crosses them or why. But the bridges at Oppenheim, long since replaced by modern structures, mark the place where German assumptions about American warfare died, where the myth of Patton as deception finally collapsed under the weight of Patton as reality, where the Wehrmacht learned that the Americans would not pause at the Rhine or anywhere else until Germany ceased to resist. The Obers who watched in confusion as American tanks rolled past his position in the dawn of March 24 carried that knowledge into captivity, the understanding that his side had been wrong about fundamental things, that the intelligence assessments and propaganda and comforting lies had all been wrong, and that the war had been lost not in that moment but long before, in the failures of perception and understanding that convinced Germany it could dismiss Patton as bogus until his tanks proved otherwise. In the end, the lesson of the Rhine is not about rivers or bridges or even about Patton himself. It is about the danger of believing what you wish to be true rather than what evidence suggests is true, about the cost of maintaining illusions in the face of contrary data, about how military organizations can become so invested in their own analytical frameworks that they cannot adapt when those frameworks fail. The Germans were convinced Patton was bogus not because they lacked intelligence about him but because accepting that he was real required accepting that their entire strategic situation was more precarious than they wished to believe. So they maintained the fiction, filed away the contrary reports, and waited for the massive, methodical, predictable American assault that would give them time to react. They received instead speed, surprise, and the sound of tank engines in darkness, crossing a river in days that was supposed to hold for weeks, proving that in warfare as in life, the most dangerous enemy is not the one you fear but the one you convince yourself does not exist until the moment he appears at your door, already inside your defenses, already victorious, already writing the history that will record your defeat not as tragedy but as inevitability, the natural consequence of believing myths over reality until reality arrives in olive drab and steel, moving east at Patton's pace, never pausing, never doubting, never giving the enemy time to hope that the Rhine might be unconquerable after all.